I work at a convenience store on the outskirts of town. It's in a pretty isolated location, surrounded by nothing but trees and empty fields. In my experience, the late shift is never really that busy, but it pays better than the morning or afternoon shifts, so I always volunteered for it. I remember one particular night, I was working the late shift, as usual, and I must have been the only one working in the store at the time. The only company I had was the sound of the radio playing in the background and the occasional car driving by on the empty road outside. Around midnight, I saw a man walking towards the store. He was wearing a long black coat and he had a black hat that was hiding his face. I could barely make out any more details about him, but he gave me a strange feeling in my gut. I tried to ignore it and continue working, but it was so difficult to shake off the feeling. When the man finally reached the store, he walked inside. We made eye contact, but he didn't say anything, and just started browsing the aisles. He was moving so slowly, his steps dragging across the floor. I could hear his laboured breathing, like he was out of breath or sick. I watched him from behind the counter, my heart starting to race, and after a few minutes, the man finally walked up to the counter. He placed a few items on the counter, but I couldn't quite make out what they were. I reached out to scan them, but as soon as I touched them, the man grabbed my hand tightly. His grip was cold and clammy, and he squeezed so hard that I thought he might break my bones. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his hot breath on my face. "Don't make any noise, and I won't hurt you." I was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The man continued to hold my hand tightly, his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't seem like he was there to rob the store, but I had no idea what he actually wanted with me. Anyway, suddenly he let go of my hand and walked away. He picked up his items and walked out of the store without saying another word. I was left standing there, scared and confused. The rest of the night was rather uneventful in comparison. I kept thinking about the man in the black coat and what he had wanted from me. Was he going to hurt me, rob the store? I didn't know. Interestingly, a few weeks later, I was again working the late shift, and it was a quiet night just like before. I was doing some inventory when I heard a strange noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like something was dragging across the floor. I cautiously walked towards the noise, and as I reached the back of the store, I saw that same man in the black coat standing there, but his back was turned towards me. He was dragging a heavy bag across the floor, leaving a trail of dirt and what looked like blood behind him. I tried to back away, but he turned around and saw me. He had a twisted smile on his face, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Hello again," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been waiting for you." I turned and ran towards the front of the store, but he was faster than me. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me towards him, his grip like a vice. He leaned in close to my ear and whispered, "You're never leaving this store." I screamed and fought against him, but it was no use. My heart was pounding in my chest, and it was at this point I realized the door was closed. I had no other option than to fumble with the door handle, trying to get it to open. But after what felt like an eternity, it finally gave way, and I threw the door open and dashed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily and my hands shaking. I knew I had no other option than to call the police, but my phone was in my locker, and of course, that was back in the other room. I thought about quickly opening the door and running in, but I knew it was a stupid idea. I decided to wait it out and hope that whoever was in there would maybe leave. I mean, there was a fire exit, so maybe he'd just cut his losses and leave, but I didn't know for certain. As I waited in the darkness, I heard those footsteps getting louder and closer. They were slow and deliberate, as if whoever was making them was in no rush to leave. I started to feel as if I was about to have a panic attack, when suddenly there was a loud banging on the door. I screamed and backed away, pressing myself up against the wall. The banging continued, getting louder and more frantic. I knew that whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't going to stop until they got in. I looked around the break room frantically, searching for something I could use as a weapon. I spotted a metal pole lying on the ground near the door. It looked like it had fallen off a shelf, so I grabbed it and held it in front of me, ready to defend myself. The banging continued, and I could hear someone yelling on the other side of the door. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, so I tried to back away even further, but there was nowhere to go. The room was small, and I felt trapped. Just as I thought the door was going to give way, I heard a voice calling out. Surprisingly, it was the voice of one of my co-workers. She'd arrived early for her shift. She was asking if anyone was in the room, and I yelled out that I was in there. She managed to pry the door open and found me huddled in the corner, still holding the metal pole. I was shaking and crying, and I could barely speak. She called the police for me, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the store and the surrounding area, but they didn't find anyone. Whoever it was in the store that night had disappeared. The police took my statement and collected evidence, but they never caught the person responsible. Safe to say, I quit my job at the convenience store the very next day. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there. I still have nightmares, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I don't know who that man was, but I know that I never want to feel that scared and helpless ever again. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural and the unexplained. So when I moved into my new neighbourhood and heard about the neighbour who lived down the street, I was immediately intrigued. Everyone in the neighbourhood had their own story about him, and they all seemed to agree that he was strange, and some even believed that he was dangerous. I had never seen him myself, but I was determined to find out more. I decided to take a walk around the neighbourhood, and as I passed by his house, I noticed that the windows were always covered in thick black curtains. It was odd, especially considering that every other house on the block had open, welcoming windows. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that something was going on inside that house that they didn't want anybody else to see. I started to notice other strange things too. The yard was always overgrown, and the house itself was in a constant state of disrepair, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it was about to collapse. One night I was walking home from a late-night study session at the library, and I decided to take a shortcut through the alleyway that ran behind my house. As I passed by the back of the creepy neighbour's home, I heard a strange sound. It was a low growl, like an animal, and it seemed to be coming from inside the house. I froze, unsure of what to do. I had never been this close to his house before, and I didn't know if I should run or stay put. But as I hesitated, the growling grew louder, and I could hear something else too. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, and they were coming towards me. I turned to run, but before I could take another step, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The curtains in the front window were now moving, as if someone was pulling them aside to look out. And then I saw them, 2 glowing eyes, staring right at me. I sprinted home as fast as I could, and when I got in, I locked all of the doors and windows and went straight to my bed. But I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes and the growling sound that I had heard. The next day, I built up the courage to investigate further. I walked past the creepy neighbour's house, pretending to be on my phone, but secretly keeping an eye out for any signs of life. I noticed in the corner of the window what seemed to be a pair of hands, pale and gnarled, gripping the edge of the curtain in the front window. In that moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I watched as the hands pulled the curtain aside, revealing a face that looked like it belonged to a horror movie. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was safely back in my own house. And that's when I finally decided to call the authorities. I told them everything I had seen and heard, and they promised to investigate. Well, a few days later, I heard the news. Apparently, this neighbour had been arrested for a string of stalking incidents that had taken place in the neighbourhood. He had been keeping people in his basement, and the growling sound that I had heard was the sound of his dogs that he had been using to guard them. It was a horrifying realization, and I couldn't believe that I had been living so close to a monster this whole time. Even now, I can still see those glowing eyes and those pale, gnarled hands, and I can't help but wonder, are there more people like him out there, lurking in the shadows? Well, I'm just grateful that he no longer lives on our street, and hopefully I will never see him again. I used to love my job. I worked as a production manager in a factory on the outskirts of town. I was the only female employee, but I had a great team and we made some fantastic products. But now everything has changed, and I've found myself living in constant fear. It started when I noticed a new employee working in the factory below me. He was always there day and night, working on the assembly line. At first I didn't pay too much attention to him. After all, we were all just there to do our jobs, right? But then I started to notice him everywhere I went. Whenever I was on my lunch break, I'd see him lurking around the vending machines. When I left work late at night, I'd see him again, loitering by my car. He never actually said anything to me, but his presence alone made me uneasy. And then things got much worse when I started receiving anonymous notes at my desk. They were always signed with a simple X, and they were always in a neat cursive handwriting. At first they were just innocent compliments telling me how pretty I looked that day, but then they started getting more aggressive. I can't stop thinking about you. I know we're meant to be together. I started to feel like I was being watched constantly. Every time I turned around, I felt like he was there, just out of sight. Honestly, I started to feel like I was going crazy. But then one day, I couldn't take it anymore. Before I spoke to anybody, I thought I'd first need to get some proof. So I started wearing a hidden camera at work, and I even had a GPS tracker installed on my car. And eventually, I got a notification on my phone. The GPS tracker had been activated. I quickly checked the camera footage and I saw him. He was walking around my car, looking through my windows. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched him try the door handle. It was locked, thank God. But this time I called the police and they actually arrested him at work the next day. They found a whole stash of notes and pictures that he'd been collecting, and even found a set of keys to my apartment. He is in jail now, but every time I see someone who even looks remotely like him, my heart starts racing. I'm not sure I'll ever be the same again. I was a college student, working part-time at a convenience store in a small town. It was the only job I could find that would fit my schedule, and even though the hours were long and the pay was quite low, I was grateful to have a job at all. The store was open 24 hours, and I often worked the late shift, which meant that I was usually the only person working in the store after midnight. On one of my shifts, I was working late as usual. It was quiet, with only a few customers coming in and out of the store. I was just sitting behind the counter reading a book most of the time, when I heard a strange noise coming from the back of the store. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, as I'd never seen anybody walk in. But the noise continued, getting louder and more persistent. It sounded like something was scratching at the door in the back room. I got up from my seat and cautiously made my way towards the sound. But as I got closer to a door, I could hear the scratching more clearly. It was definitely coming from the other side of the door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just ignore it and go back to my book. I mean, it was probably just an animal or something. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly opened the door. To my horror, I saw a figure huddled in the corner of the room. It was a woman with matted hair and ragged clothes, staring at me with wild eyes. She looked like she hadn't bathed or eaten in days, and the smell coming from her was overpowering. I was frozen in place, not knowing what to do. This had caught me at such a surprise, and the woman suddenly lunged towards me, reaching out with dirty hands. I stumbled back, knocking over a display of snacks and tripping over my own feet. I fell to the ground, hitting my head on the counter. At this point I must have been knocked unconscious, because when I eventually came to, I found myself lying on the floor, with the woman nowhere in sight. I managed to stumble to my feet, dazed and disoriented. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of the woman, and I couldn't hear that same scratching noise anymore. I made my way back to the front of the store, feeling shaken and scared. I locked the door behind me and called the police, telling them about what had just happened, and they arrived a few minutes later. But they couldn't find anyone, either in the store or in the surrounding area. There was a moment where I was actually convinced that I had just had a terrifying hallucination, brought on by my exhaustion and the late hour. Maybe I'd slipped and fallen, and the whole thing was just some sort of weird dream. But as the weeks went by, strange things continued to happen in the store. Items would move on their own, strange noises would be heard at night, and customers would regularly report feeling a sense of unease when they entered the store. Years have passed now, and I did quit my job, unable to cope with the fear and uncertainty, and also I wanted to do something that paid a little bit better. But even now, I can still feel the chill that ran down my spine that night, and I wonder what it really was that I saw in the back room. I always knew there was something off about my neighbour, Mr. Smith. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, and he never seemed to leave his house. Sometimes I would see him peering out of his window, watching me as I walked to school or played outside with my friends. It always made me uneasy, but I didn't think too much of it, at first. It wasn't until a few weeks ago, actually, that things started to get really creepy. I was coming home from school when I saw Mr. Smith standing in his front yard. I tried to ignore him and kept walking, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. When I got to my house, I looked back and saw that he was still standing there, watching me. That's when the weird things really started happening. Every time I would leave my house, Mr. Smith would be outside, either in his yard or on his porch, just watching. He never said anything. He never did anything. He just stared. And it wasn't just me. I would see him doing the same thing to my friends when they came over. One night I woke up to the sound of scratching outside my window. I was scared, but I told myself it was probably just a tree branch or something. There was a tree outside my window, so this did happen from time to time. But then I could have sworn that I heard a faint whisper of my name. I froze. I couldn't see anything outside, but I knew someone was there. I was too scared to move or even breathe, but eventually the scratching and whispering stopped, but I still didn't sleep at all that night. The next day I went to my parents and told them everything that had been happening. They were concerned, but they didn't seem to think it was anything too serious. They told me to just stay away from Mr. Smith and to come to them if anything else happened. But things only got worse from there. One day I came home from school to find a note in the mailbox. It was written in shaky handwriting, but it clearly said, "I'm watching you. I know everything." I didn't know what to do. What did this message mean? What was it that he knew? I was too scared to tell my parents, and I didn't want to go to the police in case it wasn't anything too serious. So I just tried to ignore it and hoped that it would all go away. But it didn't, because the next night I woke up to find Mr. Smith standing at the foot of my bed. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I screamed, and my parents came rushing in. But Mr. Smith didn't move or say anything. He just stood there until my parents had no choice but to call the police. They came and took Mr. Smith away, but a few days later, I found a box on my doorstep. Inside was a photo of me, my friends, and my family, all taken without any of us knowing. There was also a note that read, "I'll be back soon." This wasn't that long ago, and I don't know what to do. I'm scared to leave my house, and I'm scared to stay inside. I know he's locked up now, but there's still a part of me that feels like he's there, watching me. Also, Mr. Smith did have family that were almost just as weird as he was, and I wonder if he's getting them to do his bidding now. But nevertheless, all I know for sure is that I never want to see him or his creepy smile ever again. You know, I never imagined that I would actually become the victim of a stalker. I mean, I'm not exactly the most attractive person, and I've never really been one to receive a lot of attention. Plus, I was always raised to be careful and aware of my surroundings, but I guess sometimes being careful isn't enough. It all started a few weeks ago when I noticed a man staring at me every single time I left my apartment. He was always standing on the street corner, watching me with an intense gaze. At first, I didn't pay too much attention to him. I figured he was just a neighbour whose daily schedule lined up with mine. Or maybe he was just waiting to be picked up for work or something. But then, the seemingly innocent coincidence soon turned much darker, as I started to notice that he was following me. It was as if everywhere I went, he was there, lurking in the shadows. On one particular night, I came home late from work, and I saw him standing outside my apartment building once again. He was wearing a black hoodie, and his face was partially hidden, so I quickly made my way inside, locking the door behind me. This was the first time I saw him during the night, and let me tell you, it added a whole new level to this already distressing situation. And it didn't help that the very next day, I saw him again. This time, he was standing outside my office building, staring up at me from the street below. I tried to ignore him and went about my day, but I would look outside every now and again to see if he was still out there. And to my horror, there he was. Sometimes he would be standing there looking up in my direction, but other times I would see him sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, as if his legs were tired from stalking me all day. Well, over the next few days, things only got worse, so I finally went to the police. But they told me that there was nothing they could do, unless I had proof that the stalker was actually following me. So from that day on, I always made sure to have my phone at the ready, whenever I felt a sense of being watched or followed. There were a few instances where a man would randomly cross the street, which would always make my heart race. But luckily, none of these men were my stalker, and they would always eventually disappear down a different street. As the days went by, I gradually started to let my guard down, thinking that the stalker must have seen that I'd been to the police and knew he was on thin ice, because I hadn't seen him now for almost a week. But my optimism suddenly came crashing back down to reality when one night I decided to take a walk in the park. It was late, but I needed some fresh air as I'd been arguing with my mum on the phone and the conversation had gotten quite heated. But as I was walking, I started to hear footsteps behind me. I turned around and there he was, my stalker. I quickly attempted to turn on my camera to record him, but in my panic, my phone slipped out of my hands and fell to the floor. At this point, he started sprinting towards me, and I ran as fast as I could, but I knew he was getting closer. I turned around and saw him reaching out to grab me, so I instinctively raised my hand and scratched at his face, hoping to warn him off. Well, I firmly connected with his cheek, and I think part of my nail broke off in his eye, as he started holding his face, screaming in pain. The sound he made still rings in my ears to this day. He was completely incapacitated, and when I looked back, he was writhing in pain, rolling around on the floor. I did not stop though. I turned back around and continued running in the opposite direction, eventually making it to my apartment complex. I immediately called the police and informed them of what had happened, and they rushed right over to take my statement and make sure I was okay. They asked if I was able to get any evidence against him this time, but I burst into tears as I suddenly remembered that during that horrific experience, I had dropped my phone, and it suddenly hit me that this man had not only evaded capture, but he now most likely had my phone in his possession, and I'm sure he also had an appetite for revenge. The policewoman tried to console me and promised that they would catch him, explaining that it won't be too hard to find a man with a huge gash on his face. Well, weeks went by, and there was still no update from the police. I had really started to give up hope that they would ever find him. Don't get me wrong, I was glad to be alive, but also so angry at myself for dropping my phone that night, and I was now more paranoid than ever. But then, there was a knock at my door. I was hesitant at first to answer it, but I looked through the peephole and saw the familiar uniform of that same policewoman. I immediately let her in, and she had a big smile on her face. "I wanted to tell you the news in person." I was quite literally bursting with anticipation, waiting for what she would say next. My body collapsed in reaction to hearing those words, and the policewoman caught me, giggling and repeating those same words. "We got him." She then pulled something out of her pocket and handed it to me. It was my phone, severely cracked, but still very much usable. I broke down in tears as there were so many pictures in that phone that I had failed to back up, so the relief was honestly overwhelming. Apparently they had gone back to the scene of the crime and found my broken nail on the floor, and they took it in for testing to see if they could match any DNA to a potential criminal. And thank God, it was a match. The guy had been previously arrested for stalking his ex-girlfriend, who actually looked suspiciously like me. When they arrested him at his house, they found my phone, which immediately linked him to the crime, and he was charged later that day. I was so grateful for that policewoman, as she really fought hard to bring this guy to justice, and it's nice knowing he can't stalk anybody else for at least a very long time. But even though he's now behind bars, I'm still afraid that he'll be there every time I leave my apartment, waiting for me. And to be completely transparent, I'm not sure if I'll ever feel truly safe again. When I was younger, I lived in a small neighbourhood on the outskirts of town. Everyone in the neighbourhood was friendly, except for one man who lived in the house at the end of the street. He never spoke to anyone, and never seemed to leave his house, except for a few times a week to get groceries, I presume. As I grew older, I became more curious about this mysterious neighbour. I would often sneak over to his house and peer through the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what was inside, but no matter how hard I tried, I could never see anything more than the occasional flicker of a light. One day I was walking home from school when I noticed something strange. The front door of the neighbour's house was slightly ajar, and I could see inside. It was dark and gloomy, with no sign of any movement or life. I was about to keep walking, when I heard a faint whisper coming from inside the house. It was so quiet that I almost didn't hear it, but when I turned to look, I saw a shadow move behind the window. I was scared, but I couldn't help but be curious. I mean, I could tell all my friends afterwards, and I'd probably be the most popular guy at school. So I crept closer to the window, trying to see inside, and that's when I saw it. A hand reaching out from the darkness and beckoning me to come closer. At this point, I didn't know what to do. Should I run or stay put? Well, my curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself walking towards the open door. Looking back, I don't know why I did this. It was as if I was in some sort of hypnotic trance, or maybe I was just that stupid. But as I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of musty air, like the smell of old books. The inside of the house was just as gloomy as the outside. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was old and worn. But what caught my attention was the sound of music coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. I followed the sound, my heart racing, and as I turned the corner, I saw another door, slightly ajar, with light coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. I'd come too far to back out now, but what I saw made me freeze in my tracks. There was a room full of dolls, hundreds of them, all in various states of disrepair. Some were missing limbs and others had their eyes gouged out. But what was even stranger was that they were all arranged in a circle, facing inward, as if they were having a conversation. I tried to back away slowly, but I tripped over something and fell to the ground. As I looked up, I saw the neighbour was standing over me, with a smile on his face. "You like my dolls? I've been collecting them for years. I love the way they look when they're broken." I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the house as fast as I could. When I got home, I told my parents everything. But of course, they didn't believe me. They just told me that I was being silly and that I should stay away from the neighbour's house. I never saw him again after that day. But I still wonder about what he was doing with all of those dolls and what kind of person he really was. But to this day, I still get chills thinking about that creepy neighbour and his collection of broken dolls. It was 11 p.m. and I was just getting started on my night shift at the grocery store. My job was to restock shelves and clean up the aisles. The store was quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the occasional beep of the scanner breaking the silence. As I was making my way down the canned goods aisle, I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was the sound of footsteps, but they weren't the steady, confident steps of someone purposely walking through the store. I tried to convince myself that it was just the sound of my own shoes on the floor, but I knew deep down that I wasn't alone. I cautiously walked down the aisle, peering around every corner, and that's when I saw him. It was a man in a worn-out leather jacket and ripped jeans, and he was standing at the end of the aisle, staring straight at me. I was unsure of what to do. He didn't say anything, he didn't move, but he just stood there, his eyes boring into mine. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked away, his shuffling footsteps echoing throughout the empty store. I tried to shake off the fear and continue with my work, but there was something about that man that just wouldn't let me be comfortable. As I made my way to the other side of the store to grab some cleaning supplies, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. It was coming from the employee break room, which was supposed to be locked up for the night. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should investigate. But in the end, my curiosity got the best of me. I slowly pushed open the door, but immediately wished that I hadn't. There were 3 men in the room, all dressed in dirty clothes and rummaging through the employees' belongings. clearly looking for something to steal. One of them noticed me and reached for something in his pocket, causing me to run back out the door as fast as I could. I immediately called the police and explained the situation, and they arrived quickly, apprehending the 3 men. Stupidly, they stayed put, probably thinking that I was too scared to do anything. But the fear and anxiety that I did experience during those few minutes has stayed with me for a very long time. It was a cold and dark night when we moved into our new house. I had been looking forward to it for months and was excited to start a new chapter in my life. However, something felt off from the moment I walked through the door. It wasn't until a few days later that I met my neighbour. He lived in the house next door, and I could always see him from my kitchen window. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with grey hair and a wrinkled face. Every time I saw him, he would stare at me with a cold, blank expression that always sent shivers down my spine. At first, I tried to ignore him, and I just put it down to my imagination. But then, I started to notice something strange was happening. Every time I left the house, I would come back to find things had moved around, or they had gone missing. It was subtle at first, but it became more frequent as time went on. One night I was lying in bed reading, when I heard a noise under my bed. It sounded like someone was trying to hold back a cough. I was absolutely petrified, as I knew that sound, and it could only be a person that was making it. I jumped out of bed and ran over to my parents' bedroom, banging on the door for help. My dad rushed out with a look of concern on his face, asking what had happened. I told him that there was a man under my bed, and his concern suddenly turned to rage as he rushed into my bedroom. He flung open the door and turned on the lights, demanding that the man shows himself at once. But there was no response, so my dad slowly got down onto the floor and peered under the bed. But there was no one there. My dad then climbed to his feet, looking confused, but then his eyes locked with the window as he saw my curtain flying in the wind. He asked me if I opened my window, but I couldn't bring myself to speak, so I just shook my head. He ran to the window and looked outside, but again, there was no one there. I'm not sure whether or not he truly believed me, but my mum and dad didn't seem to be that concerned. I slept in their bed that night, but other than that, we just sort of continued as normal, as if nothing had ever even happened. But over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I would regularly catch my neighbour peering into my bedroom window as he was walking by with his dog. I knew I had to do something, so in the end I went to the police. They tried to brush it off as harmless, but I knew something was seriously wrong. I started to sleep with a softball bat by my bed, and I even set up a camera in my room to hopefully catch him in the act. And then, all of my fears were finally confirmed when one night I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I knew someone was in the house. I grabbed my bat and tiptoed down the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. And as I turned the corner, I saw my neighbour standing in my living room, holding a broken vase in his hand. He was staring at me with a look of pure distress on his face. I swung the bat in his direction and demanded that he leave, so he slowly stepped back and then opened the back door, running off into the night. I quickly called the police, and they came to arrest him. Apparently, they searched his home and found a hairbrush and several pairs of women's underwear. I was mortified, but not too surprised. He ended up confessing to breaking and entering, but refused to admit that night he was hiding under my bed. I was frustrated at first, but now I don't care so much. The main thing is that he is rotting in prison, So for now, that's good enough for me. It all started a few weeks ago during one of my soccer training sessions. I noticed a man standing outside the fence, watching us practice. At first I didn't think much of it, maybe he was a parent of one of the other girls on the team, or just someone that happened to be passing by. But when he kept coming back every week and watching us practice, I began to feel uneasy. I asked a few of the other girls if he was one of their dads, but none of them knew who he was either. I tried to just brush it off, thinking maybe he was just a soccer enthusiast who enjoyed watching games. But one day, after we were packing up after practice, I noticed him standing a little too close to me. I quickly gathered my things and hurried away, trying to ignore the feeling of his eyes following me. But then the next week, I saw him again. But this time, he was standing on the field. I tried to focus on my training, but I couldn't stop myself from peering over at him at every instance I had. After the session, I quickly made my way to the locker room and locked the door behind me. But as I was changing, I heard a faint tapping on the door. I froze, feeling a sense of panic wash over me. I peered under the door and saw a pair of men's shoes. How did he know which locker room I was in? I waited in there for a while, not making a sound, and he did eventually leave. So I quickly got dressed and left that locker room, making sure to stay with my teammates until we were safely in our cars. But the man was persistent. He would keep showing up at every training session, always lurking around and watching me. But then, on one particular night, I was leaving the training field when I noticed the man following me. I quickened my pace, but he matched my steps. I turned around and shouted at him to leave me alone, but he just stared at me with a cold, dead look in his eyes. I ran to my car and locked the doors, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. After that night, I started to see him everywhere. Not just at the soccer field, but at the grocery store, at the gym, even in my own neighborhood. I honestly felt like a prisoner in my own life, always looking over my shoulder and living in fear. But all of this chaos came to a head when one day I received a package in the mail. It was from the Stalker, and it contained a photo of me at one of the soccer training sessions. On the back he had written a message in thick black marker. "I'm always watching you." I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that he had been following me for much longer than I had realized. I immediately contacted the police and filed a report, and they assured me that they would do everything in their power to protect me and catch this man. But the fear didn't go away. Every time I left my house, I felt like I was being followed. Every time my phone rang, I would jump and think it was him. I decided to take matters into my own hands and confronted him at one of the soccer training sessions. When he showed up, I walked right up to him and demanded that he leave me alone. He just smiled at me, his eyes devoid of any emotion. As I walked away, I heard him whisper something under his breath. "I'll never leave you alone." I turned around, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows. That was the last time I saw him, but I still feel like he's out there, watching me, waiting for his next opportunity. I don't know how to make the fear go away, but I do know that I will never be able to fully move on, knowing that he's still out there, somewhere. I work the night shift at a small store in the city. I'm usually alone, and the only customers that come in at this time are people passing through or those who can't sleep. It's a pretty boring job, but it pays the bills, and I usually get some studying done during my shift, which is good. One night, however, things took a turn for the worse. It was a particularly slow night, and I was just counting down the hours until my shift was finally over. That's when I noticed a figure lurking outside the store. At first I thought it was just a passerby, but as they lingered outside for an uncomfortably long time, I started to feel uneasy. I tried to just focus on my work, but the figure outside wouldn't go away. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally entered the store. It was a tall, skinny man wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled over his head. I couldn't make out his face, but his presence alone was enough to make me feel quite scared. He rummaged around on one of the aisles and then he approached the counter, placing a few items in front of me. I tried to maintain a professional demeanour, but something about him just felt off. He didn't say anything, just handed me the items and waited for me to ring them up. As I scanned them, I couldn't help but feel like he was watching me, his eyes burning a hole through the back of my head. I tried to ignore it and focused on the register, but when I looked up to hand him his change, I saw that his face was covered with a mask. My heart raced as I tried to keep my cool. I mean, maybe it was just a coincidence. It wasn't the type of mask you'd see post-COVID, but maybe he was just trying to stay warm, I thought to myself. But as I handed him the change, he reached out and gripped my hand. "Thank you," he said in a deep, guttural voice. "I'll be seeing you again soon." I jerked my hand away from him, and he quickly turned and walked out of the store. I was relieved when he finally left, but I was left with a feeling that something was seriously wrong. I mean, when would he be seeing me again? I wished that night would never come. As the night wore on, I couldn't focus on my work anymore. Every single time a customer would walk in, I feared it would be him again. I was so on edge. I almost called the police, but I didn't want to overreact. I mean, to be fair, he didn't actually do anything illegal. Around 2 a.m, when I was finally getting ready to close up the shop, the lights started flickering, and at one point they went out completely. I panicked, reaching for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but then I heard a soft chuckle coming from the corner of the store. I spun around, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. That's when I heard it again. The soft chuckle coming from somewhere in the shadows. I tried to keep my cool, but at this point it was almost impossible. And then suddenly, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I let out a scream. I turned around to face the dark figure that had entered the store earlier, but this time he was holding something. "I've been watching you for weeks, and I know your every move." I backed away, trying to find a weapon or any way to escape, but he was too quick. He lunged at me, and I barely dodged out of the way. I knew I had to act fast, so I grabbed the first thing I saw, a can of soda from the counter, and I hurled it at his head, hoping to knock him off balance. Luckily it hit him square in the forehead, and he stumbled back, dropping whatever was in his hand. As I ran to the door, the man chased after me, and I could feel his warm breath on the back of my neck. He was now inches from me, and again began to lunge in my direction. I instinctively screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a mop bucket and falling hard onto the floor. I quickly scrambled to my feet and saw that the man was now standing directly in front of me. I could feel his eyes piercing through me, even though I couldn't quite see his face. He raised a bony hand and beckoned me towards him, with his fingers curling into a disgusting gesture. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, unable to break free from his hypnotic gaze. I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst. But instead of attacking me, the man simply ran out of the building, leaving me alone in the deserted store. I sat there for what seemed like hours, trembling and unable to move. Eventually I gathered my courage and stumbled out of the store, still shaken by what had happened. I quickly locked up and walked home, and I was looking over my shoulder the whole time, half expecting him to suddenly reappear. Well, I made it home okay, and I didn't see him again. But from that night on, I was never the same, and sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can feel his warm breath on the back of my neck, and I imagine those bony fingers curling around my wrist. Growing up, I always knew there was something off about the neighbour who lived next door to us. I never really had any direct contact with him until that fateful summer day. I remember my parents had gone out for the day, leaving me alone in the house. It was a really hot day, so I decided to take a swim in our pool. But as I was swimming, I noticed our next door neighbour standing at the fence, watching me intently. I felt uneasy, but I just tried to ignore him and continue with my swim. But then I heard him call out to me. "Hey there, little lady. You're quite a good swimmer, aren't you?" I tried to be polite, responding with a simple, "Thank you," and tried to get out of the pool as quickly as I could. But the neighbour continued to make small talk, asking me about school and my hobbies. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice that his eyes were strangely intense and seemed to be fixated on my body. Then he asked me if I wanted to come over to his house for some lemonade. I politely declined, telling him that I needed to go inside to study. But he persisted, telling me that he had some cool games and toys that I might like. It was strange. How old did he think I was? As he talked, I felt more and more uneasy. His words were almost too friendly, and I could feel that there was something off about the way he was acting, like he was putting on a show of some sort. Finally, I told him that I had to go inside, and I quickly made my way back into the house and closed the door behind me. But as I was drying myself off, I heard a knock at the door. It was the neighbour, standing there with a glass of lemonade in his hand. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that I didn't want to be alone with him. I tried to be polite, telling him that I couldn't come outside, but he just stood there, staring at me with those intense eyes. Then, suddenly, he pushed past me and entered the house, uninvited. I tried to back away, but he grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. I struggled and screamed, but he wouldn't let me go. In that moment, I was so scared. He was muttering something under his breath, and his grip on my arm was getting tighter and tighter. I screamed again, hoping that someone would hear me. And then, suddenly, my parents burst into the house. The neighbour immediately let go of me and ran out, disappearing into the woods behind our house. They didn't see the neighbour, but when I told them what happened, they were extremely concerned. After that day, I never felt safe in my own home again. I was always looking over my shoulder, worried that the neighbour would come back for me. I started having nightmares about him, dreaming that he was lurking in the shadows, waiting to snatch me away. It wasn't until years later that I actually found out that neighbour had been arrested for some other crime. I read about it in the local paper, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw his picture. To this day, I still feel uneasy whenever I think about him, and the terror that he brought into my life that day. I never truly believed that someone could become obsessed with me, let alone start stalking me. But sure enough, it happened. It all started when I noticed a man at the grocery store following me through every aisle. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming he was just shopping like everyone else. But as I left the store, I saw him again, lurking in the parking lot. Over the next few days, I would see him everywhere I went. It didn't matter if I was at work or the gym or just running errands. He was always there, watching me from a distance. One day I received a package in the mail. It was a small black box with a note attached. The note read, "I've been watching you. You're so beautiful." Inside the box was a silver bracelet engraved with my name. It was clear that whoever sent it had been paying close attention to my life. Things only got worse from there, as I started receiving dozens of text messages every day from an unknown number. The messages were always creepy, telling me how much he loved me and how he couldn't wait to be with me. I tried to block the number, but it didn't work. The messages just kept coming from different numbers. And then, one night, I came home to find that my apartment door was slightly ajar. I knew that I had locked it when I left that morning, so I cautiously pushed it open and stepped inside. Everything seemed to be in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The next day I went to the police and they took my statement, but there was little they could do. Without evidence, there was no way they could prove that I was being stalked. And one of the policemen kept repeatedly asking me, was I sure I didn't leave my door open that day? It was so frustrating. And to make matters worse, the stalking continued for weeks, and I became increasingly paranoid. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my friends and family. I remember I was walking home from the gym another night when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I quickened my pace, and the footsteps grew louder, when suddenly a hand reached out and grabbed me from behind. I screamed, but the hand covered my mouth. I struggled against my attacker, but he was too strong. He dragged me into an alleyway and pinned me up against the wall. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his hot breath on my neck. "You're mine," he whispered in my ear. I fought back with all my strength, kicking and screaming, and somehow I managed to break free and immediately ran away. He didn't catch up to me, and when I got home I called the police again, and this time they took me seriously. They actually found the stalker a few days later. He had been hiding in my apartment building's stairwell. The CCTV cameras showed that he had been watching me from there for weeks. He was arrested and charged with stalking and attempted assault, but even though he's in jail now, I'm still constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he has any potential accomplices. I can't trust anyone anymore. The experience has left me scarred for life, and I don't think I'll ever be able to feel completely safe ever again. It was a late shift at the gas station, and I was the only one on duty that night. I was behind the counter, staring blankly at the clock, waiting for my shift to finally be over. The streets were deserted, and there was nothing to do but wait for the customers. Suddenly I heard a loud noise. It sounded like someone was pounding on the window. I turned around, and I saw a homeless-looking man standing outside, punching the glass and screaming at me. I was terrified. I had never seen anyone act like that before. His face was contorted with rage, and no matter what I tried, he just kept screaming and pounding on the window. Well, after what seemed like an eternity, he eventually stopped and stumbled away. I was relieved, but I couldn't wait for my shift to be over so I could go home and try and forget about the whole thing. But about an hour later, the man returned, and this time he was even more agitated. He was screaming and yelling, demanding that I let him in. It was so strange because the door was unlocked and he could have walked in if he wanted. But for some reason, he just kept begging for me to open the door and let him in. Well, I tried to take advantage of the situation, and I quickly locked the front door and immediately called the police. When the cops eventually arrived, they managed to calm the man down and take him away. But even though he was gone, it was so difficult to shake the feeling of unease for the rest of my shifts going forward. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every time I heard a noise outside, it made me jump. I even started seeing that man's face in my dreams. And then, one night, I was closing up the station, and I heard a noise in the back room. It sounded like someone was moving around. I cautiously walked towards the back room, and that's when I saw him. That same homeless man was standing there, staring at me. I screamed for help, but there was no one there. And then suddenly, the man was on top of me, his weight crushing me. I was screaming and lashing my fingernails at him as hard as I could. He got up and ran away. I was just left lying there on the shop floor, completely shaken up and overwhelmingly scared. Well, this was the last straw. I never went back to that gas station again. The man was found and he was arrested, and my boss tried to convince me to stay, even offering me a pay rise, but that wasn't good enough for me. No way was I ever going to work a job like that again. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about the night. And every time I see a homeless person, I can't help but wonder if they're also capable of doing what that one man did to me. As a woman living alone in a quiet suburban neighbourhood, it can be quite unsettling. Even when a community can be quite peaceful, it only takes one neighbour to make things feel uncomfortable. There was a man who lived in the house next to mine. He was tall and thin and had a sunken face with dark, beady eyes. I never caught his name. He kept to himself most of the time, so I just referred to him as the creepy neighbour. At first I didn't pay too much attention to him. As I said, he mostly kept to himself and rarely left his house, so there wasn't much to say. But then, that's when the strange things began to happen. Every time I walked out of my house, he would suddenly appear outside, almost as if he had been waiting for me. He would stare at me with a strange smile on his face that made my skin crawl. One night I was alone in my house, getting ready for bed, when suddenly I heard a soft tapping at my window. I looked over to see the creepy neighbour standing in his yard, staring up at me with a sinister grin. I quickly closed the curtains and retreated to my bedroom, with my heart now pounding with fear. Over time, I began to notice that the creepy neighbour was always watching me. He would appear at odd times and places, as if he was tracking my every move. For example, whenever I walked my dog, he would always appear out of seemingly nowhere and would try to make conversation with me. Eventually, he took it one step too far and stopped me on my morning jog. I told him politely to leave me alone, but he just kept chasing after me. I warned him that I'd call the police, and he just laughed, and so I did. Unfortunately, they said they couldn't do anything unless he had made a direct threat against me. So I was on my own, with a neighbour who was becoming more and more unstable by the day. And then, one night, as I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise coming from outside my window. I looked out, and I saw the creepy neighbour digging in his backyard. It was the middle of the night, and he was digging a deep hole in the ground. My mind raced with the possibilities of what he may be doing, and I knew I had to act fast. The next day I actually went to his house and confronted him about what I had seen. He denied everything, but I could see the madness in his eyes. It was at this point that I knew that I had to leave the neighbourhood before things got even worse. The police clearly weren't going to do anything, so I was left with no other option. I moved away as soon as I could, but I still feel the weight of that creepy neighbour's gaze on me from time to time. It's been years now, but I can never seem to shake the feeling that he's still watching and waiting for me to return to his twisted world. I still remember that day that my nightmare began. It was just another day at work, and I was sitting in my office minding my own business, when I noticed a man staring at me from the corner of my eye. I turned to look at him, but he quickly turned away. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or one of those instances where you lock eyes with someone and it's awkward for a second, but then you look away and everything's fine. But as the days went by, I noticed that I kept seeing him everywhere. I tried to ignore him, but it was impossible, as I could feel his gaze on me all the time. One day I caught him following me out of the office. I could hear his footsteps, so I turned around to confront him. But when I looked, he was already gone. I would sometimes catch glimpses of him at the grocery store or even outside my apartment building. It was as if he was always just one step behind me. But things got even worse when I decided to go to the water park one day with my friends. I remember that morning I wasn't too worried because I was with my friends and I was just hoping that I could forget about my stalker for a little while. But even there I couldn't escape his gaze. I went down one of the water slides, feeling the wind rush past me, and that's when I emerged at the bottom with him standing there as if he was waiting for me. I screamed and ran, but he grabbed me by the hair and dragged me into the changing rooms. I couldn't believe how unlucky I was that nobody saw us, and he locked the door behind and began to touch me inappropriately. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard someone banging on the door. The man panicked and ran, but not before he whispered in my ear, "I'll be back for you." I never went back to that water park after that day. I spoke to the HR department on the Monday, and I asked them if there was anybody that we employed that fit his description. But to my horror, there was nobody in the office that was even remotely like this man. It was at this point I realised that he must have broken into our office, and that was the scariest thing of all. I knew I had to do something at this point, so I went to the police. They told me to start carrying pepper spray with me wherever I went and install security cameras outside my apartment in an attempt to catch him. But none of my methods seemed to deter him, because he was still always there. But he never seemed to make a move. And that's when I received the note on my doorstep. It said, "I'm always watching you." I went to the police, but they again just said that they had no proof and therefore couldn't really do anything. I was so frustrated, and I knew then that I had no other choice but to leave. I packed my bags and moved to another city, hoping that I could escape him. I haven't seen him again since then, but even now, years later, I still feel his presence sometimes. It's as if every day I'm just waiting for the moment that he returns. It was a typical late shift at the convenience store where I work. I was stocking the shelves and trying to stay awake when I noticed a woman entering the store. She looked dishevelled and her eyes were darting around the store like she was searching for something. That's when she approached me and immediately demanded that everyone get out of her shop at once. I was so confused and told her that it wasn't her shop, but a convenience store. The woman became increasingly agitated and started throwing things off the shelves. There were a few customers in the store at the time, and they attempted to leave, but she blocked the entrance and wouldn't let anyone out. I tried to reason with her, but it was clear that she had some sort of mental issues. I called the police and waited for them to arrive, and when they did, they tried to talk to the woman to get her to calm down. This is when she started throwing bottles and screaming at them. It was like she was possessed by some sort of demon. They had to physically restrain her and take her away in handcuffs. After the police left, I was left alone in the store, shaken and scared. It was then that my night got even worse. A group of men suddenly burst into the store, knocking over displays and shouting. They made their way straight to the alcohol section and started shoving bottles into their pockets. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but then one of them spotted me in the corner of their eye, and I felt my heart drop as he started to approach me. In that moment, I was sure that I was going to die. I mean, this truly was a night of horrors, but luckily, a miracle happened. The door burst open and several police officers rushed in. They managed to apprehend the thieves and eventually led them away in handcuffs as well. I breathed a sigh of relief and collapsed onto the floor. I mean, could this night get any worse? Well, I guess you could say that it did, when one of the apprehended thieves managed to wriggle out of the grip that one of the police officers had on him, and he started banging against the window, shouting something about needing money and how we were all liars. It really caught me off guard. I mean, there were so many police officers around, yet there were still so many scary things happening. The man continued to pound on the window, his face twisted in rage. It was honestly like something out of a movie, when finally one of the police officers brought him down to the floor, and they took him away. Every little sound after that made me jump, but when my shift finally ended, I walked out of the store and into the cool night air, and I was so grateful to be alive. To this day, I know I will never forget my night of horrors. When I tell people the story, they don't believe me at first. I mean, I probably wouldn't myself. But to think, after I had to deal with a mentally ill woman basically holding everybody hostage in the store, followed by a group of men trying to rob a bunch of alcohol, Could you even imagine a worse night shift? It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was sitting in my living room with my wife, watching television. We had just moved into a new neighbourhood, and we were still getting used to our surroundings. Our house was in a quiet cul-de-sac, and our neighbours were a mix of young families and elderly couples. However, there was one neighbour who stood out for all the wrong reasons. He lived 2 doors down from us, and from the moment we moved in, he made it clear that he did not like us. Every time we saw him outside, he would glare at us with his piercing blue eyes, and mutter something under his breath. We tried to ignore him and hoped that he would eventually warm up to us, but that never seemed to happen. One night I woke up to a loud noise outside. I got out of bed and went to the window, and that's when I saw our neighbour in his front yard. It was 2 a.m. and I couldn't understand what he was doing. I watched him for a few minutes just pacing up and down his garden, before eventually going back to bed. The next day, my wife and I decided to take a walk around the neighbourhood, but as we were passing by his house, he came outside and started yelling at us. He was screaming, "What are you doing here? And you don't belong in this neighbourhood." He started following us and continued to shout insults in our direction. Let me tell you, it was a terrifying experience, and we walked back to our house as fast as we could. As the weeks went by, his behaviour only got worse. He would stand in his front yard and stare at us whenever we left or came back to our house. He would always make loud noises in the middle of the night, and he would throw things in our garden. We tried to talk to him and ask him to stop, but he would just become angrier and even more aggressive. And then, one day, my wife and I came home to find a note stuck to our front door. It was from that very same neighbour, and it said he was going to make us pay for moving into his neighbourhood. We were terrified and didn't know what to do. Believe it or not, things only got worse from there. His staring had turned to stalking, as he started following us whenever we left the house. He would park his car outside of our house and would watch us from inside. We were living in constant fear, and we didn't know how to make it stop. He wasn't doing anything illegal, and the police would just apologise whenever we'd speak to them. But finally, the chaos inevitably came to a stop one night, when I woke up to the sound of someone trying to break into our house. I quickly woke my wife up and we called the police, and when they arrived, they found our neighbour outside, trying to break into the front door with a crowbar. He obviously wasn't the most intelligent man, as he was trying to break the door open on the wrong side. Nevertheless, he was arrested and taken away, and we never saw him again, but the fear and anxiety that he had caused us stayed with us for a very long time. Looking back on it now, I realised that we should have taken his behaviour more seriously from the beginning. I guess at the time, we were just too scared to do anything about it. But to be fair, this experience has certainly made us stronger. I just hope that it's one we will never have to go through again. It all started on my 25th birthday. My friends had thrown me a surprise party at a trendy bar in the city. We were having a great time, laughing and drinking, when I noticed a man staring at me from across the room. At first I thought he was just admiring me from afar, but the longer I looked at him, the more I realised that he was fixated on me. It made me feel incredibly uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off and just enjoy the party. But as the night went on, I caught him multiple times staring at me, and he would always look away quickly when I made eye contact. I started to get worried, wondering if he was following me or just a creepy stranger at the party. Well, one night when I was walking home from work, I noticed that that same man was on the opposite side of the street. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, but he was still there, lurking behind me. I didn't know whether to confront him or to just keep going and pretend that I didn't even see him. But that's when I noticed he was now on the same side of the road to me, and was right behind me. I turned to look at him, but he just smiled and walked away. I hoped that that was the end of it, but after that encounter, things only got worse. He started leaving creepy messages on my voicemail, always breathing heavily into the phone, and saying strange, unsettling things. I even came home one day to find a bouquet of dead flowers on my doorstep, along with a note from him, saying, "I'll always be here." I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that this wasn't just a harmless crush that he had on me. Well, for the rest of the year, I'd see him every now and again. I would never confront him as I was too scared. But to be fair, he never actually did anything. He would always just watch me from afar, and I never really had any physical contact with him. That was until the night of my 26th birthday. This time I decided to throw a small gathering at my apartment. I remember at this point the last time I saw him was probably a month or two ago, but I was still slightly nervous that he might show up. Nevertheless, I tried to push those thoughts out of my head and just have a good time with my friends. But as the night wore on, we all started to hear strange noises coming from outside. It sounded like someone was trying to open the front door, and my heart raced as I realized that this could be him. I grabbed a wooden rolling pin for protection and cautiously made my way to the front door. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there with a twisted grin on his face. He tried to push his way into my apartment, but my friends were behind me and they started screaming at him to leave. Eventually, we were able to overpower him and we held him down until the police arrived. He was arrested and charged with assault and stalking, and so now I sleep a little better at night knowing that he's behind bars. But the trauma of that experience still stays with me, and I do have trouble trusting strangers. Even now, I always double-check the locks on my doors and windows, worried that he might come back. I had recently moved over to the US from China for college, and I was working at my local McDonald's to earn some extra cash. It was the middle of winter, and I was working until 2 a.m. to cover a friend's shift. There was a weird old man who worked as a cleaner at the restaurant. He always spoke to me on my breaks and gave me inappropriate comments about my appearance. On this particular night, the old man was also on the late shift, cleaning the floors by the front doors. As I was walking out at the end of my shift, he tried to talk to me as usual, and as he was blocking the doors, I tried to be friendly and make conversation with him to avoid any awkwardness. He asked me where I was originally from, and I told him China. He then asked if I missed my family, and I said yes, but I would be seeing them soon, as I was planning to visit them for a few weeks. He then jokingly asked if he could come with me and promised that he would behave, saying this with a creepy smile on his face. I awkwardly laughed and tried to edge past him to go out the door, but he just continued to insist that I could in fact trust him, and that he had always wanted to visit China, so it would be perfect. I began to feel very uncomfortable, but I just laughed again, hoping that he would take the hint and let me go. However, he still continued to block the doors, and didn't seem to be taking my hints at all. I didn't know what else to do, so I just said goodnight and asked if I could squeeze by, but in response, he lifted his mop and was now purposely blocking the door. Sorry, I can't let you leave without a goodnight hug. It's a late shift tradition, and rules are rules. I froze in shock as I really did not want to hug this man. I stood still for a few seconds before he suddenly leaned over to wrap his arms around me. As his fingers touched my waist, there was a sudden knock at the door that caught the cleaner off guard. He sheepishly let go of me and turned around. It was a customer asking if the McDonald's was still open. I instinctively squeezed past the cleaner and opened the door to greet the customer, and politely explained that we were closed. I used this opportunity to escape and stormed off towards my car. With my adrenaline running high, I unlocked the door and jumped inside as quickly as possible, fumbling to put my key in the ignition. But as my car started pulling away, I noticed the cleaner standing at the window, waving at me, with that same creepy smile on his face. I put my foot down on the gas and raced out of that car park as fast as I could. After that night, I always refused to take the night shifts, but every now and then I would still bump into that cleaner. Luckily though, as it was always busy at the time, I was always able to avoid him. But nevertheless, it wasn't long before I quit that job and didn't look back. Shockingly, or maybe not so shockingly, a few months later I received a text from one of my ex-co-workers who told me that the cleaner was recently arrested in Thailand for stalking local women. He was consequently fired from his job at McDonald's due to his conviction, and it actually turned out that he had an unhealthy obsession with Asian girls. I was so creeped out when I heard the news. It made me realise just how lucky I was to have gotten away from him when I did. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened if that customer hadn't knocked on the door that night. As a young girl, I always felt uneasy around my neighbour. He lived alone in a rundown house with overgrown weeds in the front yard. He never seemed to leave his house during the day and only came out at night. His appearance was unsettling, with long, unkempt hair and deep-set eyes that always seemed to be fixed on anyone that passed him by. One evening, as I was walking home from a friend's house, I noticed that neighbour standing on his porch. He stared at me with a blank expression, not even bothering to wave or say hello. I quickened my pace, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice strange occurrences. I would hear noises coming from my neighbour's house at odd hours of the night, but when I peeked out my window, there were no lights on. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him through the window, pacing back and forth in a dimly lit room, and it always freaked me out. One night, as I was laying in bed, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like it came from my neighbour's house. I didn't dare to look, I was too scared, but as I laid there, I heard footsteps outside my door. I clutched my blankets tightly and waited, hoping it was just my parents. But then suddenly, my bedroom door creaked open. I could see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, but I couldn't quite make out any details. My heart was pounding so hard in that moment, I thought it might have burst out of my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, but I still couldn't make out his face. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, unable to find my voice. As the figure stepped closer, I could smell the stench of alcohol. He leaned down, his face now just inches from mine. "Well, don't be afraid. I'm just lonely." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that he would just go away, and when I opened them again, he was gone. After that night, I never saw him again. I did hear rumours that he had moved away, but I never knew for sure. When I think back to that night, I do sometimes think it could have just been a dream. It was always a little bit strange that I didn't see him again after that night, but realistically, I don't see how he could have climbed into my house. Or maybe I just can't handle the truth. But either way, I still get chills thinking about that night. And I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been so lucky. I always thought that my life was normal. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had a good job, great friends, and I lived in a nice neighbourhood. But that all changed when I started getting strange messages from an unknown number. At first the messages were just innocent enough, asking me how my day was or telling me to have a good one. I just assumed it was spam and I ignored them every time they came through. But that's when I noticed that they started to get more and more frequent, and the tone of the messages became increasingly aggressive. One message would read, "You look beautiful today," but then another would say something like, "I'm watching you." Again, I tried to ignore them, thinking they were just from the wrong number or a prankster, but
things got even weirder after that. I would come home from work and little things in my apartment had been moved around. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but there was a small part of me that was severely scared that someone had been in my apartment. Things only got worse from there, as I would now get phone calls in the middle of the night, and when I would answer them, I would hear heavy breathing on the other end of the line. It felt like no matter what I did, someone was always there watching me. And that's when, one night, I was walking home from a friend's house, when I saw someone following me. I turned around, but they ducked behind a parked car. I tried to pretend that I hadn't seen them, to hope that they would just stay hidden, but as I walked away, I could hear footsteps behind me growing louder, and suddenly I was grabbed. I was fighting back as hard as I could, but I was no match for them. They were so strong. But just as I thought that my life was all over, I heard a voice from behind me. "Let her go!" I looked towards the sound, and there was a man running over to us. The stalker immediately dropped me and ran in the opposite direction. I excessively thanked the man who had saved me, and it turned out that he was someone who lived in the same building as me. We actually dated for a little while after that, but we ended up just becoming good friends. We did eventually end things as I had to move to a new city for work, and I took it as my chance to start my life over. I did go to the police, but they were never able to find anyone, so I would live in constant fear. This experience was years ago now, and I've somewhat moved on, but it certainly has left me more paranoid and anxious. And to be honest, I don't think I'll ever be able to truly trust anyone ever again.
It was a cold winter night, and I was working the late shift at the local Walmart. I had taken the shift to cover for my colleague who was sick, but I regretted it as soon as I started working. The store was eerily quiet, and the dimly lit aisles made the whole situation seem even more sinister. As I was stocking the shelves with chips, I heard a strange noise coming from the other side of the store. It sounded like someone was dragging their feet. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was probably just my imagination, or maybe a customer had walked in, and it was nothing to actually worry about. But the noise grew louder and closer. I cautiously peeked around the corner, and to my horror, I saw a dishevelled man shuffling towards me. He was wearing tattered clothes and had a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say a word, but just kept shuffling towards me, inch by inch. I tried to stay calm and asked him if he needed any help, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a box of matches and brandished them in front of me. I froze in shock, unsure of what to do. What did this mean? Was he going to burn down the whole store? I was so confused, and that's when the man started to close in on me, his breath hot and heavy on my face. I could smell the stench of alcohol and cigarettes on his breath. I frantically looked around for a weapon, but there was nothing in sight. But in a moment of desperation, I grabbed a can of hairspray from the shelf and sprayed it directly into the man's eyes. He recoiled in pain, and I took the opportunity to run towards the exit. But as I approached the door, I noticed a group of people were standing outside, all dressed in identical white robes. They were chanting in an unknown language, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if they were perhaps with the man, but then I remembered the danger behind me, and with a burst of adrenaline, I pushed past them and ran out into the night. I looked back, and they were all just staring at me, motionless. It was incredibly eerie, and the image is still seared into my brain. I called my boss, but when he arrived, they were all gone. Apparently, they were part of a local cult, and they were harmless, but something about the look in that crazy man's face told me otherwise. I begged my manager to take me off the late shifts after that, which he did, but none of my colleagues have ever had a run-in with them since. Maybe it was just a coincidence that I was on shift that night. Or maybe They're just waiting for another chance to get me alone.
I was always an independent woman, never the type to rely on anyone else to get through life. But that all changed when the stalking began. It started small, with strange messages being left on my car windshield at work. At first I brushed it off as a harmless prank, but soon the messages became more sinister. And that's when I saw him for the first time. I was walking back to my apartment after a long day of work. It was already dark out, and the streetlights cast eerie shadows across the empty sidewalks. As I turned the corner, that's when I saw a figure lurking in the shadows. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could feel his eyes were on me. I quickened my pace, trying to put some distance between us, but the figure seemed to keep up with me, but just staying out of sight. Well, eventually I was able to lose him, and I managed to make it to my apartment unharmed. But over the course of that year, the stalking became more frequent and invasive. I would find strange objects left at my doorstep, like a single black glove or a lock of hair. It was like someone was playing a twisted game with me, so I even tried to move to a different part of town. But that didn't even make a difference. He would always seem to find me. One particularly unnerving experience happened during my volleyball practice. I was out with my teammates focusing on the game, but that's when I saw him, standing on the sidelines staring directly at me. He was wearing a hoodie and black sunglasses, but I could tell it was him by the way he moved, like he was trying to blend in with the crowd. I panicked, feeling exposed and vulnerable, but I just tried to focus on the game and deal with that situation after. But I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze burning a hole in my body. After the game finished, I got home safe and sound, but I was still scared. I invited a few close friends over and explained to them what had been happening, and they rushed right over immediately. We were having a really good time, and I'd almost completely forgotten about my stalker. But as the night wore on, I started to notice strange things happening. I had been drinking that night, so I assumed that it was just my drunken mind playing tricks on me. But I could have sworn that there were doors that I had locked that were now suddenly open, and I could definitely hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Well, it wasn't until the next day that I found the note. It was written in shaky handwriting, with strange symbols and words that I couldn't understand. But there were two words on that note that were clear as day: watching and waiting. I knew at this point that I had to take action. After discussing the situation further with my friends, they all told me that I should probably move out of my apartment, seeing as he knew where I lived. To be fair, I was looking to move out of that place for a while now, so I just took this as an opportunity to start my new life. Luckily, I haven't seen him again since then, but even now, every time I turn a corner or step out into the street, I get this overwhelming feeling of fear. The stalking had gone on for almost a year, and the memories still haunt me, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free from that fear. I always knew there was something off about my neighbour Mr. Johnson. He was an old man in his 70s, and lived alone in the house next door to mine. I would often see the flickering of the candlelight through his windows. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think too much of it, until one day, I was playing in my backyard. I noticed that Mr. Johnson's garden had grown wild with weeds and brambles everywhere. It looked like it hadn't been tended to in years, and I could see that he had a small shed at the back of the garden, but it was almost completely hidden by the overgrown foliage. As time went on, I started to notice other strange things about Mr. Johnson. He would come out at night, always dressed in dark clothing, and I could hear him walking around his backyard in the early hours. Sometimes I would hear him even talking to himself. muttering words that I couldn't understand. I remember I was lying in bed when I heard a strange noise coming from Mr. Johnson's house. It sounded like someone was moving heavy objects around. I decided to investigate, and I crept out of my house and into my backyard. As I peered over the fence, I could hear Mr. Johnson's muttering growing louder. I looked through his window and saw him moving furniture around, talking to himself all the while. But as I was watching, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. They were small, beady and yellow, and they belonged to what looked like a rat that was perched on the windowsill. I took a step back in surprise, but then I noticed something else. There were rats everywhere, on the floor, on the furniture, crawling up the walls, and Mr. Johnson was completely oblivious to them, still just muttering to himself and moving objects around. I decided to leave at that point, and quickly went back to my house feeling sick to my stomach. But the next day, I saw something that made me even more creeped out. Mr. Johnson had set up traps in his garden, and there were dead rats lying everywhere. As I watched, he picked one up, examined it closely, and then I saw him put it in his pocket. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This weird behaviour made me start to feel like I was in danger, like Mr. Johnson was capable of anything. I decided to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me at first. I pointed out his garden in the upstairs window and begged them to look at all of the traps, and to be fair to them, they were concerned and contacted the authorities once they saw what I was talking about. When the police arrived, they found Mr. Johnson in his house, surrounded by rats apparently. He had become delirious, and he would always mutter to himself about the rats and how they were his only friends. They discovered that he had been hoarding food, water and other supplies for years, and that he had been living off the rats in his garden. It was a disturbing sight, and it still haunts me to this day. In the end, we had to move away because the rats were starting to infest in our own garden. Nevertheless, I still think about him from time to time. But I just hope that I never have to encounter anyone like him, ever again. It all started when I was at the ice skating rink. I loved to skate and would often go after work to unwind. It was my escape from the stresses of everyday life. But on this particular day, I noticed a man watching me intently. He was tall and muscular, and he had a piercing gaze that made me feel very uneasy. At first I thought he was just another skater waiting for his turn on the ice. But as time went by, I realised that every time I went to that ice skating rink, he was never actually skating. He was always just standing there. His presence really made me feel uncomfortable, and I started to worry that he might be following me. I didn't confront him, as I guess I assumed in the back of my mind maybe he was just a parent or potentially a boyfriend of someone that was ice skating, and maybe he was just waiting for them. But that all changed one night when I heard a knock on my door, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw him standing there. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. He just kept knocking, and I could hear him whispering something. I was too scared to answer the door, but he wouldn't go away. It wasn't until maybe about 30 minutes later that he eventually gave up, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But after that night, I would see him even more often than I did before. It was like he was taunting me, just letting me know that he was always there. I tried to change my routine, but it was no use. He always seemed to find me. I started carrying pepper spray with me just in case, and I would check my car for any signs of tampering before I got in. But one night, as I was leaving the ice skating rink, I saw him waiting for me in the parking lot. As I walked to my car, he started to approach me, and I started running. I could feel his presence getting closer, and I'm pretty sure he tried to grab me. but I managed to make it to my car and rushed in and locked the door behind me. I looked out the window and I saw him walking in the opposite direction, almost as if he was trying to pretend that he hadn't done anything. Well, I started my car and I got the hell out of there and drove straight home. I didn't see him again after that incident. It was almost as if he missed his chance and he had accepted that he was never going to have me. But that certainly doesn't make me feel any better about the experience. He's still out there somewhere, and I know it's only a matter of time before I see him again.
Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.